The old woman slowly entered the clinic, the soft tap of her cane echoing through the quiet hallway. Her movements were deliberate, each step measured as though she had done this hundreds of times before, but today there was something different in her gait. Perhaps it was the tiredness in her eyes, or the way she adjusted her glasses that made it clear she wasn't here for a routine checkup. She was a woman who had lived through decades of life, and now, with the passing years, her body seemed to be giving up on her. She looked around the crowded waiting room, where several other patients sat, lost in their own worlds. A few young mothers, a couple of middle-aged men, and an older man with a walker, each person absorbed in their own thoughts, but all of them waiting, just like her. The walls of the clinic were lined with brochures for new treatments, pamphlets on health tips, and reminders to get annual flu shots. Everything here seemed to promise solutions. But as the woman took a seat, she didn't feel any promise at all. She only felt the weight of time. Margaret had been visiting doctors for years, and while she still believed in the value of healthcare, she wasn't naive. She had faced surgeries, treatments, and countless appointments before, and yet the experience never got easier. Doctors always seemed to assume that as people aged, they became invisible, or at best a nuisance, a shadow of their former selves. And Margaret, having lived so long, had learned how to let their dismissiveness roll off her shoulders. But even she couldn't help but wonder, would today be any different? As she waited, her thoughts drifted to the same familiar places, the aches in her joints, the difficulty breathing sometimes, the constant fatigue. She knew her body was telling her something, but she didn't know if the doctors would listen. Sometimes it felt like the older you got, the less doctors took you seriously. They assumed your complaints were just a part of getting older, even when you knew deep down that something wasn't quite right. Her name was finally called. Margaret stood up, a bit slower now, and walked toward the door with her cane, her back slightly hunched. As she stepped into the doctor's office, she noticed the young man behind the desk. He looked barely old enough to be a doctor, certainly no older than her youngest grandchild. He didn't even look up as she entered. Instead, he stared at his computer screen, tapping away at the keyboard as though she were just another name on his list. "Please, have a seat," the doctor said without looking up, his voice cool and uninterested. Margaret settled into the chair across from him, adjusting her glasses as she tried to get comfortable. There was an awkward silence between them, and Margaret felt herself fidgeting slightly, unsure of what to say. She had seen enough doctors to know the drill, the standard questions, the obligatory medical history check. But there was something about this doctor that felt different, not in a good way. "Let's see," the doctor muttered as he quickly flicked through her medical file on the screen. His eyes skimmed over her history of heart surgery, arthritis, and respiratory issues, and then, without a moment's hesitation, he asked, "So, what brings you in today?" Margaret hesitated for a second, wondering how much to say. She had been here before, explaining the same symptoms to so many doctors, but every time it felt like they listened less and less. Still, she knew she had to try. "I've been having trouble breathing lately," she said quietly. "My chest gets tight and sometimes I feel like I can't catch my breath. It's been going on for a while now." The doctor didn't look up. He just nodded, still typing on his computer as though he had already decided what the problem was. "Well, you're getting older, aren't you?" he said, barely making eye contact. "That's probably just part of the aging process. Your body changes, things don't work as well as they used to. How old are you again?" "I'm 75, Margaret replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But this isn't just age. This is different. I've had these issues before, but it's been getting worse." The doctor paused for a moment as if considering her words, but he didn't seem particularly concerned. All right, we'll give you something for the pain. Maybe it's your lungs or just some general discomfort. I'll prescribe you something for now." Margaret felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. She had hoped for more, something that would get to the bottom of what was really happening to her. But instead it seemed like she was just another patient he was going to push through as quickly as possible. "Anything else?" he asked, still distracted, flipping through a few more screens. Margaret took a deep breath, trying to calm the frustration bubbling up inside her. She was no stranger to being overlooked, but it still hurt. "Actually, yes," she said, her voice shaking just slightly. "I've also been feeling really fatigued. More than usual. I have trouble sleeping at night. Sometimes I can't seem to get a good breath even when I'm lying down." The doctor looked up for a moment, finally giving her his full attention, but it was only for a brief second. You're probably just stressed. You know, stress is a big factor when you get older. It can make everything feel worse. Have you thought about taking it easy? Maybe do some light exercises or... He stopped mid-sentence, clearly already moving on to the next thing. Look, we'll get you a prescription for the breathing issues. If it gets worse, maybe we'll refer you to a specialist, but it sounds like normal aging. Margaret sat there feeling the sting of his words. Normal aging? That was the blanket explanation for everything. She wasn't a fool. She knew what it felt like when something was really wrong. But how could she argue with a doctor who already had his mind made up? The doctor scribbled something on a notepad and handed her the prescription. He barely made eye contact. "You can pick up the medication from the pharmacy," he said as if the conversation was over. Margaret stood up slowly, her heart heavy with disappointment. She didn't argue. She didn't want to make a scene. But deep down she knew this wasn't right. She had trusted doctors all her life, but in this moment, she felt as though she had been reduced to a number, a mere box to check off in someone's schedule. As she walked out of the office, cane in hand, Margaret couldn't help but feel the weight of the years on her shoulders. She had been through so much in her life, but somehow, in this modern world of quick consultations and rushed appointments, she couldn't help but wonder, were people like her, the elderly, ever truly seen anymore? Or were they just a collection of symptoms, waiting to be treated as quickly as possible without anyone really listening? The door to the clinic closed behind her, and Margaret walked out into the bright sunlight, her cane tapping on the pavement. She was determined, as she always had been, but today a small part of her felt a little defeated. The following day, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling of being brushed aside. The doctor's quick diagnosis still echoed in her mind. It's just a part of aging. Every time she thought about it, the words seemed more dismissive. She had been around long enough to know the difference between normal aging and a real health issue, and what had happened in that appointment felt like more than just age catching up with her. It felt like she was being written off. Still, she didn't want to be one of those people who complained constantly. So many of her friends at the retirement community had given up, accepting their aches and pains as inevitable. They would talk about their illnesses with a resigned sense of, what can you do? But Margaret had never been like that. She had always tried to stay active, keep her mind sharp, and take care of her health. She knew that her body was aging, but that didn't mean she had to accept every problem that came with it as normal. Something didn't feel right, and she wasn't ready to ignore it. For the next few hours, Margaret tried to push those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the little things. She called her daughter, chatted with a neighbor who stopped by to check in on her, and even baked a batch of cookies, a hobby she had enjoyed for years. But when the house grew quiet and the sun began to set, her thoughts returned to the clinic. It wasn't just the doctor's words that upset her. It was the way he treated her, like she was invisible. He hadn't even looked her in the eye, hadn't taken the time to listen to the full story of her symptoms. There was a moment during the appointment when she tried to explain how difficult it was to breathe, how her chest felt tight, but he had barely heard her. It wasn't just the lack of empathy, it was the way he dismissed everything she said as though it didn't matter. Margaret wasn't a child, and she wasn't some fragile old woman who needed to be coddled. But she did expect to be treated with respect. She had spent years teaching young students the importance of listening, of truly understanding someone before jumping to conclusions. Yet here she was, the one who was being ignored. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was the mailman, delivering a letter she wasn't expecting. It was from the clinic. She opened it cautiously, her heart racing a little as she pulled out the paper. It was a standard receipt for her recent visit, but underneath that there was a note from the doctor. He was suggesting a follow-up consultation. Margaret blinked in surprise. After all that, the doctor wanted to see her again? It didn't make sense. Why hadn't he taken her seriously the first time? The thought of going back to the same office filled her with a quiet dread. But a small part of her also felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this time he would listen. Maybe this time he would take her symptoms seriously. As she sat down with the letter in her hand, she thought back to her visit the day before. The doctor's condescending tone, his complete lack of empathy. It was all so fresh in her mind. She had walked out of that office feeling smaller than she had in years, and it bothered her more than she wanted to admit. But she couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease in her chest. She had learned over the years to trust her instincts. Something was wrong, and she knew that if she didn't push for answers, no one else would. She thought of how her friends and neighbors had begun to accept their ailments as part of getting older, and she refused to let herself fall into that trap. Margaret decided to call the clinic the next morning, determined to get to the bottom of her condition. She knew she wasn't being dramatic, that what she was feeling wasn't just a part of getting old. She had lived long enough to understand her body, and right now it wasn't working the way it should. When the receptionist picked up the phone, Margaret's heart began to race a little. She explained her situation and asked for another appointment with the doctor, hoping that this time he would take her seriously. After a few moments, the receptionist returned to the line. "The doctor is available tomorrow at 10:01 a.m., she said. Margaret agreed, though her stomach churned at the thought of facing that doctor again. But she couldn't back down. If this was going to get better, she needed answers. She hung up the phone, took a deep breath, and reminded herself that she wasn't going to let her age define her or make her feel invisible. The next morning, Margaret arrived at the clinic a little earlier than her appointment. She sat in the same waiting room, her cane resting by her side as she glanced around at the other patients. This time she tried not to let her mind wander too far. She focused instead on her breathing, trying to calm the anxiety that had settled deep in her chest. When her name was called, she stood up slowly, adjusting her glasses as she walked toward the door. As she entered the office, she noticed the doctor was seated behind his desk, but he wasn't looking at the computer screen this time. He actually looked up as she walked in. "Good morning," he said, though his voice still had an air of detachment. Margaret nodded but didn't speak right away. She wasn't sure what to say to this man. She had a lot on her mind, but there was something about his presence that made her feel unsure. "Please, take a seat," he said, motioning to the chair in front of him. Margaret sat down, but she couldn't help but feel a little defensive. She had already been treated poorly once, and now she wasn't sure what kind of reception she would get this time. She folded her hands tightly in her lap and waited, determined to speak her mind. The doctor glanced at her chart briefly before looking back at her. "So," he said, his tone still clinical, "you've come in again to discuss your breathing issues?" Margaret nodded, though she felt a slight tension rising in her chest. "Yes," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "But I want to make sure you understand this isn't just normal aging. Something's wrong." The doctor didn't interrupt, which was a small victory in itself. Instead, he raised his eyebrows slightly as though he was actually listening now. Margaret wasn't sure if it was because he had a second chance to deal with her, or if something had clicked for him. But she decided to take this moment to explain everything she had been feeling. She spoke slowly at first, describing how her chest would tighten at night, how sometimes it felt like she couldn't catch her breath even when lying down. She explained how she had been exhausted for weeks, struggling to get through even simple tasks. And she told him with quiet determination that she wasn't simply making excuses. She wasn't just complaining because she was getting older. This felt different. The doctor listened carefully, occasionally nodding, but for the first time, Margaret could see that he was actually paying attention. His eyes softened, and she noticed a slight change in his posture. He seemed less dismissive. After a few moments of silence, the doctor spoke again, his voice more thoughtful than it had been before. "You're right," he said, finally acknowledging her. "This sounds more serious than I initially thought. I'm sorry I didn't listen to you yesterday." Margaret blinked in surprise. The apology was unexpected. She had almost forgotten what it felt like to be truly heard, to have someone take her words seriously. The doctor cleared his throat, flipping through her file. "Let's get to the bottom of this. We'll run a few tests and make sure we understand what's going on." For the first time in days, Margaret felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she was finally going to get the answers she needed. The next few days felt like a blur. Margaret found herself pacing around her small living room, thinking about the appointment, the doctor's apology, and the possibility that she might finally be getting the care she deserved. She had never expected to hear the words he had said to her at the end of their last meeting. They were simple yet powerful. "I'm sorry I didn't listen to you yesterday." For someone like Margaret, who had spent so many years being brushed off or underestimated, those words had meant something. They felt like validation, like the recognition of her worth, as though she was being seen for the first time in a long while. In the following days, she kept herself busy with little tasks, folding laundry, watering the plants on her balcony, and preparing her favorite meals. But her mind was never far from the doctor's office. She couldn't help but wonder, would the test reveal anything? Would they finally explain why she felt so out of breath, so tired? Part of her dreaded the thought of bad news, but another part of her felt a surge of hope. For once, she wasn't being told to just accept it. This time, they were going to look deeper. The next morning, Margaret got up earlier than usual. She took a long shower, took extra care with her clothes, and even fixed her hair. A small effort to remind herself that she was still in control of her own life. At 75, it wasn't easy to keep up appearances, but she knew that her health was not just about how her body felt. It was also about how she felt in her mind and heart. Today was important. She needed to face it with strength, even if she felt a little vulnerable inside. When she arrived at the clinic, she was greeted by the familiar receptionist, who handed her the forms for the tests that would be done. There was a slight pause, then the receptionist smiled and said, "We'll take good care of you today." Margaret gave a small, grateful nod, though she couldn't help but feel a little nervous. What if the test didn't show anything? What if she was just imagining it all? But deep down, she knew this was her chance to find out for sure. She had waited too long to ignore her instincts now. The tests went smoothly. Blood pressure checks, lung function tests, and a blood draw. The nurse who took her blood was gentle, chatting with her about her favorite hobbies. For a moment, it almost felt like she wasn't just a patient, she was a person, and that small kindness made Margaret feel a little less invisible. When everything was done, the nurse led Margaret back to the waiting area, telling her the doctor would be in soon to discuss the results. Margaret sat down in one of the chairs, tapping her fingers lightly on her knee as she waited. The minutes seemed to stretch on, but she told herself to stay calm. She knew they were doing their best to get her answers, and that was all she could ask for. Eventually, the doctor walked in. He was holding a clipboard, his expression more serious than before. For a brief moment, Margaret felt a flash of anxiety, but she quickly reminded herself that she had already taken a huge step. Now she just had to face whatever was coming. The doctor sat down across from her, looking at the results on his clipboard. He didn't speak immediately, but Margaret didn't mind. She was used to silence in medical rooms, waiting for the words that would either bring relief or fear. After a few moments, the doctor looked up at her and met her eyes. "Well, we've got the results," he said, his voice steady but compassionate. "I'm glad you came in for further testing." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She held her breath, waiting for the rest. "The good news is," the doctor continued, "there doesn't appear to be anything terribly urgent or life-threatening going on. Your heart seems to be in good shape, and your lung capacity is better than we initially expected considering your age." Margaret let out a small sigh of relief. She had feared the worst, something serious, something that would change her life in ways she wasn't ready for. But hearing that there was no immediate danger was a comfort, even if the road to getting there had been long. The doctor paused for a moment, reviewing the test results again. Then he turned back to her with a thoughtful look. "However," he said slowly, "there are some signs of early-stage emphysema. Your breathing problems could be linked to that. It's not uncommon for people your age, especially if they've had a history of breathing issues or if they've been exposed to environmental factors over the years." Margaret blinked, processing the information. Emphysema? She had heard of it, of course. Her late husband had battled with lung issues in his later years, but she had never imagined it would affect her too. She had always tried to stay active, walking every day, doing her best to stay healthy. But the idea of a condition like emphysema, something that could affect her for the rest of her life, was difficult to swallow. The doctor seemed to notice the shift in her expression. He leaned forward slightly, his voice softening. "I know this isn't what you wanted to hear, but it's important to understand that it's manageable. With the right care, we can slow down the progression of emphysema and make sure your breathing doesn't get worse. There are medications and therapies that can help." Margaret nodded slowly. She was trying to take it all in, to understand what this diagnosis meant for her. She wasn't sure if she felt relief or sadness, but at least she had some clarity now. It wasn't just age, there was something more. There was a name for it, a reason for the way she had been feeling. The doctor continued, explaining treatment options, including inhalers and breathing exercises that could help her manage the condition. He spoke about lifestyle changes like quitting smoking, which Margaret had stopped years ago, and avoiding heavy physical exertion. He even referred her to a pulmonologist, a specialist who could help her create a long-term plan for managing emphysema. For the first time in days, Margaret felt like she could breathe easier. Even though the news wasn't exactly what she had hoped for, she had come to the clinic feeling uncertain, feeling like her body had betrayed her. But now, she had a name for the problem and, more importantly, a path forward. As she left the doctor's office, she felt a mixture of emotions. There was still a sense of unease, the weight of the diagnosis pressing on her chest, but there was also something else, a sense of empowerment. She wasn't going to let this condition define her. She wasn't going to give up because of a label. There were treatments, strategies, and support available to her, and she was going to use them. On the way home, Margaret stopped by the small cafe near her apartment. She hadn't treated herself in a while, and today felt like the right time. She ordered a cup of tea and a slice of her favorite lemon cake, and sat by the window watching the world go by. The sun was shining, and for the first time in a long while, Margaret realized that she was still very much alive, still very much a part of the world around her. As she sipped her tea, she thought about her next steps, seeing the specialist, taking the medication, learning to manage her condition, and most importantly, she thought about what the doctor had said. It was manageable. There was hope. She still had time. The next few weeks after the diagnosis felt like a whirlwind. Margaret was back at the clinic for a follow-up visit with the pulmonologist, a specialist who would help guide her through the process of managing her emphysema. Though she was still processing everything, a part of her felt strangely relieved. At least now she had a plan, and that was something she hadn't had in a long time. The pulmonologist was patient with her. He took his time explaining the specifics of her condition, discussing the various treatment options, and reassuring her that many people lived with emphysema for years, even decades, as long as they followed the right course of action. Margaret listened carefully, but her mind kept drifting to her own life, her daily routines, her past struggles, the memories of her younger years when everything seemed possible. She had never been one to shy away from challenges. Over the years, she had raised children, cared for her aging parents, and managed her own household, all while staying active and maintaining a positive outlook. She had always pushed through her problems, no matter how tough they were. But now, facing this new health challenge, she felt a bit uncertain. The world around her had changed, and the body she had trusted for so long was beginning to show signs of age. It was harder to do the things she once did so easily. The walks, the gardening, the errands, everything took longer. But that didn't mean she was ready to give up. After her appointment with the pulmonologist, Margaret went home and spent some time thinking. She had been given several medications to help manage her symptoms, inhalers to make breathing easier, pills to reduce inflammation, and a list of breathing exercises to practice each day. It felt overwhelming at first. How was she going to remember it all? How would she be able to follow through with everything? But she also knew she couldn't just give in. That afternoon, Margaret decided to take a walk. Even though her breathing was still labored, she felt the need to get out of the house, to feel the sun on her face and the fresh air around her. She grabbed her cane, slowly stepped out of her door, and made her way down the sidewalk. As she walked, she noticed the little things, the sound of birds chirping in the trees, the smell of flowers blooming in the neighbor's yard, the soft rustle of the leaves in the breeze. She hadn't always taken time to notice these things, always rushing from one task to the next. But now, it was as if the world had slowed down and she had time to appreciate it. Margaret made it to the park at the end of the block where she usually sat on the bench and watched children play or read a book. She sat down slowly, feeling the coolness of the metal against her legs. For a moment, she simply sat in silence, watching the world go by. She saw a young mother with a stroller, a man jogging with his dog, and an elderly couple walking hand in hand, smiling as they talked. She couldn't help but feel a pang of longing. When had life gotten so complicated? When had things become so hard? But then she shook her head, determined not to fall into the trap of self-pity. Life had always been full of challenges. She had faced many over the years, and this one wouldn't be any different. She had always pushed forward, and that's what she intended to do now. As Margaret sat there reflecting on her life, something unexpected happened. A little girl came running up to her, a bright smile on her face. The girl stopped in front of Margaret, breathing heavily, but looking happy. "Hi," she said cheerfully. "I like your cane." Margaret chuckled softly, surprised by the sudden attention. "Thank you, dear. It helps me walk," she replied with a smile. The girl nodded, then asked, "Can I sit with you?" Margaret, a bit surprised by the question, nodded and patted the spot beside her. "Of course, sweetie." The girl climbed onto the bench and sat next to Margaret, still looking up at her with wide eyes. "My grandma has one like that too," she said, pointing at Margaret's cane. "She says it helps her walk like you." Margaret smiled, thinking of her own grandmother, who had been a constant presence in her life when she was young. She had always admired her grandmother's strength, the way she carried herself with such dignity and grace despite her age. Maybe in some way, this little girl reminded her of the way her grandmother had made it through life's challenges. "Well," Margaret said, feeling a bit of warmth in her heart, "I think we all need a little help sometimes, don't we?" The girl nodded vigorously. "Yep. My grandma says the best thing is to keep going even when it's hard." Margaret's smile widened. It was simple advice, but it was exactly what she needed to hear right now. It was so easy to forget the small lessons we learn when we're younger. Lessons about resilience, about not giving up, about appreciating the small moments. The little girl, without even realizing it, had reminded Margaret of those important truths. As the sun began to set, Margaret said goodbye to the girl and made her way home. The walk back felt easier, as though the conversation had lifted some of the weight from her shoulders. She knew her health would continue to be a challenge, but the weight of the diagnosis didn't feel so heavy anymore. She had a plan. She had her medications, and she had a new determination to face each day, no matter what it brought. Over the next few weeks, Margaret made a point of incorporating her breathing exercises into her routine. Every morning, she would sit by the window with a cup of tea and spend 15 minutes doing the exercises the pulmonologist had recommended. She didn't rush through them. Instead, she focused on each breath, allowing herself to relax as she worked on strengthening her lungs. It wasn't easy, and at times it was frustrating, but she kept going. Her walks became a bit longer, too. She couldn't go as fast as she once did, but she didn't mind. She was still moving, still breathing, still living. She had learned to pace herself, to listen to her body when it needed rest, and to push a little harder when it felt possible. One afternoon, a few weeks after her diagnosis, Margaret met her daughter at the cafe down the street for lunch. It was a simple meal, soup, a sandwich, and some fruit, but it was enough to make Margaret feel connected again, to feel like herself. They talked about everything, her daughter's work, the grandchildren, and of course Margaret's health. "So, how are you feeling, Mom?" her daughter asked, looking at her with concern. "Are you keeping up with the treatments?" Margaret smiled, stirring her tea gently. "I am. I'm doing better, I think. It's not easy, but I'm learning to take things one step at a time." Her daughter nodded. "I'm really proud of you. I know it's been a lot to take in, but you're doing great. And you're not alone in this." Margaret's heart warmed at her daughter's words. It had been a long time since she'd allowed herself to lean on others, but hearing this made her realize that it wasn't a weakness to accept support. It was okay to ask for help. It was okay to be vulnerable. As they finished their meal, Margaret found herself feeling a sense of peace she hadn't had in a long time. Life wasn't perfect. It was never going to be without its challenges. But she had learned something important. No matter what, she would keep moving forward. With each breath, each step, and each moment, she was still here, still part of the world around her, and that was enough. As the weeks turned into months, Margaret continued to adjust to her new reality. Life had become a series of small changes, some big, some small, but each one had added up, shaping her routine and her mindset. She had settled into the rhythm of her treatments, her daily walks, and the breathing exercises she did every morning. At first, it had all seemed so overwhelming, but now, with time, it was becoming second nature. Her doctor had told her that managing emphysema was a long-term commitment. There were days when she felt frustrated, when the breathlessness seemed a little too much to bear, or when she found herself missing the days when she could run errands without stopping for a breath. But there were also good days. Days when she felt stronger, when her lungs felt a little clearer, when she was able to walk a bit farther without feeling exhausted. She had come to appreciate those good days even more than before. One of the changes Margaret had made, after speaking with the pulmonologist, was her diet. She had never been one to indulge much in sweets or processed foods, but now she was more conscious of the foods that could support her lungs. She started eating more leafy greens, fish, and whole grains, and she made sure to stay hydrated. The idea of nourishing her body to help it heal gave her a sense of control. It wasn't just about managing her condition, it was about taking care of herself, inside and out. Her daughter had been a constant support, checking in on her regularly, taking her out for lunch when she could, and making sure she had everything she needed. Margaret had always been the one to care for others, so it felt strange to be the one receiving care. But she slowly came to realize that it wasn't a sign of weakness, it was a part of the journey. Everyone needed help at some point. Even she, the strong, independent woman who had raised a family, needed to lean on others. That wasn't something to be ashamed of, it was just part of life. In the mornings, after completing her breathing exercises, Margaret would sit by the window in her living room and watch the world wake up. The sun would slowly rise over the horizon, casting a soft glow over the neighborhood. She enjoyed the quiet of those moments, the stillness before the busyness of the day began. Sometimes she would watch the birds that came to her small garden, hopping from branch to branch, chirping as they went about their business. It was a reminder that life was full of small, beautiful things. Even on the harder days, those little moments of peace helped her keep going. Margaret had always loved to read, and she had rediscovered her love of books during this time. After her diagnosis, she had found herself drawn to stories about people who overcame adversity, about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. She spent hours reading, losing herself in stories of strength and resilience. They reminded her of her own capacity to face challenges, to keep moving forward no matter what life threw at her. One afternoon, as she sat on her balcony reading a book, her neighbor from across the hall stopped by to check on her. He had always been kind, but had kept to himself for the most part. But recently, he had started stopping by more often, offering to run errands for her or just to sit and chat for a while. "Afternoon, Margaret," he greeted her with a friendly smile. "Afternoon, Jack," she replied, putting her book down. "How are you today?" "I'm doing well, thanks," he said, stepping onto the balcony and sitting down in the chair beside her. "How about you? You've been looking a bit better these days." Margaret smiled softly, feeling the warmth of his words. "I'm doing okay," she said, "taking it one day at a time." Jack nodded in understanding. He had lived in the building for years, and over time he had seen Margaret come and go, always strong, always busy, always taking care of things. But now he saw her differently. He saw the vulnerability in her, the way she had slowed down, the way she was learning to live with her new limitations. It was a reminder to him that life wasn't always predictable. We all had our challenges, and sometimes the bravest thing was simply getting through the day. "I'm glad to hear that," Jack said. "You know, if you ever need someone to talk to or if you need help with anything, don't hesitate to ask." Margaret appreciated his kindness more than she could express. It was hard for her to ask for help. It had always been hard, and she still felt that instinct to push through on her own. But she knew that Jack, like her daughter, was offering support without judgment. And that made all the difference. It reminded her that she wasn't alone in this journey. As the months went on, Margaret's condition remained stable, and while she still had some bad days, she had learned to manage them better. She understood the importance of listening to her body, of resting when she needed to, and of finding joy in the small moments of life. Her focus had shifted. Instead of looking at the world through the lens of what she couldn't do, she began to see it through the lens of what she could still do. She continued to walk, though not as quickly as she once did. She no longer rushed through the neighborhood. She took her time, enjoying the sights and sounds around her. Some days, she would sit in the park and watch the children playing, the young parents running after them and the elderly couples strolling hand in hand, much like she had done years ago with her own late husband. Those moments reminded her of the fullness of life, of how it was constantly moving forward, no matter where we stood. One morning, while she was out for her walk, Margaret spotted a familiar face in the distance. It was a woman she had met briefly at the clinic months ago. They had chatted for only a few minutes, but something about the conversation had stayed with Margaret. The woman had been waiting for her own diagnosis, and Margaret remembered how nervous and uncertain she had seemed at the time. Now here she was, walking toward Margaret with a smile on her face. "Margaret," the woman called out. "It's so good to see you." Margaret waved and smiled back. It's good to see you too. How have you been? The woman paused to catch her breath, smiling brightly. I'm doing well. I started my treatment and it's been helping. Not perfect, but much better. Margaret felt a warm sense of camaraderie. They had both been through something difficult, and here they were, connecting over their shared experiences. Good for you, Margaret said. I'm learning to take things one day at a time, too. They walked together for a while, chatting about their experiences, their treatments, and how they had both found strength in small victories. Margaret felt a sense of connection that she hadn't realized she was missing. There was something comforting in knowing that other people understood what she was going through, that she wasn't alone in this journey. As they reached the end of their walk, Margaret felt lighter, more at peace. She realized that life wasn't about fighting against the changes, about trying to ignore the limitations. It was about finding peace in the moments she had, about living fully within her new reality. It wasn't always easy, but it was enough. Margaret's life had changed in ways she hadn't expected, but as she stood there, watching the sunset with her new friend, she understood something important. We don't always have control over what happens to us, but we do have control over how we respond. And in that moment, she knew that no matter what the future held, she was ready to face it with strength, resilience, and a heart full of gratitude.